there are no more holiday supercards because of the changes in wrestling. Christmas night was the greatest night of the year for professional wrestling, and Thanksgiving was a close second. And there are no more shows on Thanksgiving night. There are no more shows on Christmas night. Big Time Wrestling's running Thanksgiving Thunder this weekend. It's on Friday still. That's something. But for the most part, since there are no more territories, and since the current WWE wrestlers think they have a tough schedule because they wrestle 4 whole times a week, they're allowed to be home with their families on Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving and et cetera. But 30 years ago, it was Starrcade 86. The first $1 million gross gate in history of the NWA. 60-something thousand people left their homes that night to see Starrcade 86 either live in Greensboro in Atlanta or on closed circuit in so many of the other Carolinas towns and all the way to Kansas City and down in Puerto Rico, I believe. And that was just that event, because also the WWF had an event on Thanksgiving and the other territories had events. When you think about it, for years and years, Thanksgiving night, Starrcade 83 through 87 was on Thanksgiving night. But before that, Thanksgiving night wrestling was a tradition in the Greensboro Coliseum. Whether it be a big show or a tag team tournament or whatever, they would do 16,000 people live. And I don't know whether you remember this, Brian, because you're a young man and also you didn't grow up there, but in the 60s and 70s, the Crockett territory in the Carolinas was so big and had so much talent in those 3 states, North and South Carolina and Virginia, that they actually ran 2 shows on Thanksgiving night. Have you heard about this? Have you read about this?
I'm not too aware of that, no.
They had, and Dave Meltzer did a nice write-up on this a few years ago in The Observer, but Greensboro obviously was at the Greensboro Coliseum was the big show, but they would do other show up in Norfolk at the Scope, and they'd do 16,000 people in Greensboro, and they'd do another 7,000 or 8,000 or maybe more in Norfolk. And a year ahead of time, they'd book the NWA champion, and they'd either put him in Norfolk because a world title match always drew, and then put the hot angles in Greensboro, or vice versa. And they'd bring the Funks in from Amarillo, and they'd bring a lot of the NWA talent in. And in one territory, between 2 shows, they would do 25,000 people live just on Thanksgiving night. And then at the same time, when you would leave Greensboro and you would go 340 miles southwest down to Atlanta, the Omni would run Thanksgiving night, either with a big card or a tag team tournament. They'd do 12,000, 15,000 people. Reunion Arena in Dallas for that period in the 80s when the Von Erich boys got hot, they'd do a sellout, 18,000 people, Thanksgiving night. At the same time, the Omni and the Greensboro cards were going on. The New Orleans Superdome, if you wanted to go just a little bit east from Dallas, Watts established that tradition for Mid-South Wrestling, where the year we were there, they had 14,000 people at the Superdome. And that, by the way, was one of 4 Superdomes they ran that year, and 25 other cards in New Orleans at either the Downtown Auditorium or the UNO Lakefront Arena. So New Orleans in 1984 did somewhere around a little bit over 1 million fans for wrestling. But Minneapolis, St. Paul, Vern Gagne, the AWA, when they got hot, they did some Thanksgiving shows up there. And I believe beforehand there might have been a tradition up in Milwaukee or another one of their towns. But the only territories that really didn't have a Thanksgiving tradition were territories like the Tennessee territory, because they were weekly. It was a little bit harder to get up for a big super card on a holiday when you'd just been there 7 days beforehand. But so usually that was Nashville, because the guys mostly lived there and they could be home to eat dinner with their families and then run down to the fairgrounds. But explain to me, once again, some people are always trying to say, oh, wrestling's so much bigger now. Explain to me how just between 5 or 6 different promotions you would have almost 100,000 people going to see, leaving their homes, buying a ticket, parking, and going to see something live in person, just in 5 or 6 different territories. And with other small shows from all the other territories sprinkled around. And now there is nothing that day. There's nothing on Thanksgiving night except maybe some guy's running his hometown rec center because it's his birthday. How is that? How have we devolved that badly?
It goes back to this whole we're not doing any of the things that made the wrestling business successful discussion. I pulled up a cool one here, Jimmy. Let me know what you think of this show. It's from my programs. I just had this around, actually. Thanksgiving Wrestling Extravaganza, Louisiana Superdome, November 27th, 1980. So this is 1980. The main event, lights out, not sanctioned by Mid-South Wrestling, no disqualification, Paul Orndorff versus Ernie Ladd. For the North American Championship, again, no disqualification, the Grappler defending against Killer Carl Cox. And one of the cool little things in the program here, Carl Cox listed as Omaha, Nebraska. The Grappler, about 20 question marks.
Yeah.
His special challenge match, Ernie Ladd and Bad Leroy Brown versus the Junkyard Dog and Cowboy Bill Watts. USA versus Russia, Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream versus Nikolai Volkov. Ted DiBiase versus Mark Lewin. Jake Roberts defends the Louisiana State Championship against Paul Ellering. A special tag match, Wahoo McDaniel and Stephen Little Bear versus the Mexican Angel and the Turk. Jim Garvin versus Ron Cheatham. And in the opening match, Coco Samoa versus Mike Miller. What a show.
And, there's a thing you mentioned. Dusty was there, and Dusty wasn't in the Mid-South territory full time at that point, but he would be brought in for Superdome shows. But guys like whoever the NWA world champion was, or the American Dream Dusty Rhodes, there was always a struggle for Andre the Giant on Thanksgiving night because they wanted him in Atlanta. They wanted him in Greensboro. They wanted him up in the WWF in those days. Guys like that were literally booked months, if not a year ahead of time for Thanksgiving night because they were the big attractions, and they could pretty much name their own price, or they were in store for a hell of a payoff because wherever they were was going to be a huge fucking house on Thanksgiving night. And now once again, I know everybody's out there saying, well, I'm sure the wrestlers are happy to be home with their families on a holiday now, Jim, instead of going out and wrestling somewhere. Yeah, well, those guys were happy to be home the day before Thanksgiving with their families, and then they were happy to go and make $2,500 or $5,000 or more. Our payoff for Starrcade 86, me and the Midnight Express, was $10,000 each. That was 30 years ago. That translates to about $27,000, I believe, when I worked it out recently for a column today. So the point is, would you rather eat turkey with your in-laws or would you rather make 27 grand on Thanksgiving Day?
Yeah, I'd take the money. And, the other thing is we're talking about how different the wrestling business is. I wonder if shows like this did exist. And again, it's an interesting little vacuum because obviously the business is so different. But would the fans come out the way they once did, the way they were once ready to come out on a Thanksgiving Day and go to a wrestling show? Is there too much entertainment now on TV? Are there too many other distractions that would cause people not to do that?
Well, that is true. It's when you have people in a habit and you keep them in the habit, it's hard for them to break the habit. But once they break the habit and they find other things to do, and then they find out there are other things to do, then you can't reestablish that habit. So no, it wouldn't work today like it once did. Well, I mean, nothing in wrestling draws today like it did in those days, as evidenced by these figures that we've just mentioned. But in those days, basically after you ate Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner and opened your presents or talked to the in-laws or whatever, the only other thing, no restaurants were open except Waffle House. There was nothing to do for entertainment to buy a ticket to except for bowl games if you were in that market, or the movies. Movies were open, but otherwise, most restaurants were closed. Most stores were closed. Most places and most markets, until cable came in, you had 3 TV stations. So, so it was easy to convince people that they were going to see something more exciting by going to the wrestling matches than they would if they sat at home. But I think if we had kept up the tradition, at least it would have lasted a little bit longer. Because, for example, when WCW bought Crockett Promotions, the first thing they did was move Starrcade to the day after Christmas. I think it was a Wednesday night in 1988, and did a pay-per-view. And they still had a pretty good crowd in Norfolk at the Scope. But that was the end of it. From then on, Starrcade just became another WCW failing pay-per-view that went down as the years went by under Jim Herd. The wrestling promoters exacerbated the problem by they abandoned Thanksgiving night before the fans abandoned Thanksgiving night. And I'll tell you, in Smoky Mountain, we always did the Thanksgiving Thunder Tour, and in our little markets, and bear in mind, this was only 6, 7, 8, 9 years after Starrcade 86, when well over 100,000 people across the country went to live wrestling, and more saw it on closed circuit. We couldn't get Knoxville the first couple of years on Thanksgiving night because we weren't established, and they wanted like twice the rent and double overtime. So we went to Hazard, Kentucky, and I looked this up because it was interesting. We went to Hazard, Kentucky on Thanksgiving night of 1992. And in Hazard, Kentucky, do you know how many fans that we drew on Thanksgiving night?
No.
1,197.
Wow.
That place was fucking hopping in Hazard, Kentucky. We drew and tried to draw 1,200 people now to a wrestling show, period, right? And we went back the next year and had a little bit less help from the TV station that we did the year before, and drew just under 1,000, but 1,000 people in Hazard, Kentucky. The first year in 92, we had to do the Knoxville show on Sunday afternoon of Thanksgiving weekend. And we did just under 1,400 people with the sponsor comps. And that was kind of a special deal because we had a couple of sponsors that paid for tickets and then they gave them out. So I consider most of those paid. But anyway, we did just under 1,400 people on the Sunday afternoon. So the next year we tried the Friday night because we still couldn't get in on Thanksgiving night for a reasonable price. And we did just under 1,200. But then the following year in 94 in Knoxville, we had established ourselves with the building enough where they were able to give us some breaks where it was feasible. And we ran Thanksgiving night in Knoxville and did over 1,800 people. And this was, folks, in 1994, the only other territory in existence was Memphis. So they may sound like small numbers compared to what we talked about in the 80s, but nobody else did anything. So I'd rather have 1,800 and something than none. And Johnson City was another one where Johnson City, we did almost 1,000 people in 92 and did almost over 800 in 93. And then finally got it up where we did 1,300 people almost in 94. And that was the Saturday of Thanksgiving weekend. Paintsville, Kentucky did 745 people in 94, the Friday after Thanksgiving. Paintsville, Kentucky. Now Ring of Honor goes to Chicago. It doesn't do 700 people. Those people were willing to come for the holiday weekend, even in those little small towns, because it was a tradition that they still remembered, but nobody else was giving it to them. So, I think that now it's too late now, obviously. But I think that the wrestling promoters abandoned the holiday tradition. And our numbers actually in Christmas were even better. We did a couple thousand people a couple of years in a row, Christmas night in Knoxville, when we were finally able to get Christmas night. I think the wrestling promoters abandoned the holiday tradition before the wrestling fans did. And then once that they had no wrestling to go to, something that they'd done every year. I've talked to people in Greensboro, talked to people in several different places that looked forward to it every year. That was their thing. Whether it be eating a turkey, opening the presents, it was always followed by wrestling. And then all of a sudden it was gone for them. So they had to find other things to do. And now there's plenty of other things to do, and they found those things. And I think it's, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but it's just a shame when you think of all the tens of thousands of people that packed these arenas, and now there's nothing, no more.
Yeah. The whole idea of the holiday shows. I mean, if you're a fan of world-class wrestling, every big event was a holiday show. Every big event was Thanksgiving Star Wars, Christmas Star Wars, Labor Day Star Wars, every holiday there was.
4th of July.
Yeah.
Tarrant County Convention Center, 12,000 people, 4th of July, 1985. I was sitting there looking at it.
I mean, I'm looking right now at the results for Thanksgiving Star Wars 83. And obviously, because Starrcade was happening in Greensboro, they couldn't get the NWA champion for this show. So they had to rely on their own crew, plus Junkyard Dog coming in as an attraction. And they sold out Reunion Arena for Kerry beating Michael Hayes in a Loser Leaves Town match.
Yeah. And then 1983 was really the pinnacle, because when you think about the Starrcade crowd, and you think about the Superdome, and you think about Reunion Arena, and you think about Minneapolis, St. Paul, because I believe that was the last hot show there that Hogan probably appeared at. Right there, 4 or 5 shows, that was 100,000 people.
At least. Plus, I mean, how many closed circuit locations were there for Starrcade?
In 83, I don't have the list in front of me, but there was probably, I would say, at least a dozen.
So there's more people you could add to that number.
Hey, but what do we know?
We only care. What do we know?
What do we know?